All right, welcome back. So in the last video, we had a look at the main differences between quantizing in terms of using time compression and expansion, and quantizing in terms of detecting transients, slicing your audio clip region event based on those transients, and then quantizing the region start to a grid, whether it be 16th notes, 8th notes, regardless. We had a look at those different workflows. We also had a look at the concept of dealing with manual editing and having to deal with things like backfilling audio. So for example, in this section over here, where I would have to literally pull this back and create a crossfade if I wanted to use that workflow to make sure that my edits and everything was completely transparent. In this video, what I wanted to have a look at is specifically dealing with working with time compression and expansion and how these three DAWs deal with each of those. So to start off with, let's hop into Pro Tools. All right, so I've done some stuff here already with this loop, but what I'm going to do here is just click None, and then it gives me the option to revert or commit. I'm just going to revert, which brings us back to a blank slate. So this is this loop right over here. Playing. Let's go ahead and solo this out. I'm not going to bring in the click for now, and I'll play it. Okay, so this is a loop that I brought in from The Art of Brushes, Volume 3. Okay, you know, a lot of the times when you work with loops, you may have something that it pretty much sounds good, but you may have two elements that are kind of flamming against each other. And realistically, you just need to fix one thing. Like maybe it could be this transient over here or this one. There's something that just isn't jiving between two groups. I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of a zoom on my waveform, not the level, just visually so we can see these transients a little bit better. In fact, we might as well go full screen like that. Okay, so I mentioned elastic audio in the first volume 1 of my video series over here, and elastic audio being that it allows you to make tempo adjustments and deal with time compression and expansion. Now, this is often referred to as pocketing audio, pocketing something into a groove, or pocketing two tracks against each other, or making two tracks work. So in Pro Tools, we have elastic audio. Now, the first thing to note here is this time base selector over here. Mostly for people who are working for music, and anytime you're dealing with things in tempo, you're going to want to have it set on ticks. So I've got this set on ticks, and a quick tip if you need to set all of your elastic audio tracks to ticks is that let's just change this to samples and let's change this to samples. If I hold down the option modifier and select ticks, it's going to change everything to ticks. Okay, fair enough, we're set to ticks. The next thing you need to do is you need to choose an algorithm. So this is all based on the type of content it is, the program material. Now in Pro Tools, we've got some different algorithms available. We've got these real-time options. Now I've also got Xform installed, which is a rendered only algorithm because it takes up a lot of CPU power. I got to be honest with you, I don't use Xform that much anymore, especially since I've been in Studio One for the last 2 years. But let's talk about these different algorithms. Well, polyphonic, for things like maybe guitars, jazz guitars, guitars with chords, acoustic guitars, piano, polyphonic would be the best choice. For things like drum loops, rhythmic is going to be the one you need to choose. Anything that's like a vocal or say a lead guitar where it's just individual notes, monophonic. And then Varispeed is another algorithm that has to do with slowing down and record stops and stuff like that. So you can play with that for experimental or production techniques, but the main three ones you're going to be using would be polyphonic, rhythmic, and monophonic. So let's go ahead and let's choose the polyphonic algorithm. Okay, so now that we've chosen that algorithm, now let's talk about how to get our warp markers in Pro Tools. So we've got some different views here. It's currently set to waveform, and as you know, we've got, volume, and then based on whether you're in a Pro Tools Vanilla or Pro Tools HD. This is Pro Tools HD I'm running here. I've got some other options that are not available in the standard Pro Tools, but let's go ahead and let's use warp, or we could look at analysis. This is what it has done in terms of a warp analysis, in terms of the detection points. But let's go ahead and let's go to the warp mode. Now, we've got a couple different options in terms of adding warp markers. One option here, I've got this whole audio region or clip selected over here. So one option is if you hover, you just drop down a little bit, we can double click and we can turn these analysis points, we can turn them into actual warp markers. Now, if you're not clicked on it, if you haven't selected it, you can do that with a double click as well. One other thing that we can do, and this is really handy, if you hold down Shift and then you click on a point, you'll notice that it adds 3. It will anchor down the point before and after. And what this is useful for is obviously when you want to just adjust one point over here. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in terms of concepts like adding, you just need to maybe change the pocket of a downbeat. So for example, if I just needed to change this, I would hold down the Shift key, give myself that one point, but it's locked it down before and after. So now I could quite easily just adjust this. And then based on whether I have grid settings on or not, I'm able to slip this, right? But like I said, it also works in the opposite order. If I'm working in slip mode, which is basically a no grid mode, let's just zoom in here a little bit. If I hold down my modifier key in Pro Tools, I can temporarily put myself into a snapping mode. So this is snapping now according to the grid boundaries that I've set up in Pro Tools. So in this case, it's a 16th note. I could set that to less, 64th note, and then this now I'd be slip mode, hold down a modifier. Now I'm snapping to 64th notes, right? So that's a good way to be able to just adjust one point. If I needed to adjust a pocket of, let's say, just this area over here, I could zoom in on this one point over here, hold down my Shift key, which is going to lock down my before and after point. My after point is just outside of the screen, but there it is over here. And now I can adjust this freely, or by holding the grid, I can snap based on my grid values. So that's pretty much it. I mean, in terms of Pro Tools, that's the basic concept. I can click any one of these. I can single click them if the event's not selected, the region. I can single click to turn any of these warp markers or warp transient detection points into a warp marker, which can then be edited. Now, one thing to keep in mind here too is I can also highlight across these if I want to, and I can move these together. So for example, I could highlight across all of these and move the entire phrasing of here. So I could keep this phrasing intact and I could move things around. So if you want to keep the relative groove in the pocket, that's a good way to do it, is just by highlighting across these. And Pro Tools and Studio One both handle this very nicely, where we can maintain this pocket, but I can move things so that I'm adjusting things just as I need it. Now, I can also add a manual point if one hasn't been added. For example, there is one here that I could click, but let's say I didn't want it at that position. I can hold down some modifier keys over here, for instance, the Control key, and I can set a point so this would be more right at the transient. Now I could grab this and move this, or hold down my modifier key to snap to the grid or let go, and I could move this. So you can really kind of keep the general groove of your loops, but by doing things like shift selecting or selecting multiple warp markers in Pro Tools, and then by, sliding and slipping them around and then maybe just taking one of these and snapping it to a grid, you're able to maintain the relative groove that they have whilst locking them to each other. And we're going to look at that specifically in a later video, but I just wanted to kind of outline dealing with the warp markers in Pro Tools. Now we can also, by holding down the Option or Alt key and clicking, I can remove these warp markers over here. Now keep in mind, it's not removing the transient detection that's happened in the background, and I can single click to bring them back at any point in time. All it's doing is it's removing the warp marker. And if you had anything that had happened in terms of quantizing something to this point, it would go ahead and it would restore the natural timing. So let's go ahead here, hold down Shift to get these three. And let's go ahead, and now we're going to bring up our quantize menu again in Pro Tools. And this time, let's deal with elastic audio events. So remember in the first video, we dealt with audio clips. Well, elastic audio events are essentially these markers, these warp markers that we've created over here. And that's how we would go about quantizing them, is we would just select the elastic audio events over here, and then I could select a strength, click apply, and it's gone ahead and it's quantized according to those points. So that's the basics of working with elastic audio in Pro Tools. But before we go, I want to have a look at one thing that's really important to be aware of. If you see this bracket ever, let's say, for instance, you don't see it here. Here you see it because there's a point lockdown. Here you do see a bracket, and there's a reason for that. Because we haven't locked down some of these points, if I was to take this right now and move it, I'm actually sliding. I'm changing the duration of this loop entirely. So it's no longer fitting as a perfect loop in this particular BPM. So it's very important that you remember to lock down these events where you can. Now, because I've locked down this last event, now I could add a point over here and I could change this. So it's kind of, just think of it as, an elastic band with a thumbtack at the end, a thumbtack at the other end, and then you do have a thumbtack in the middle, but you kind of, take it out of the wall for a second and you can slide it over to the left or the right. There's still tension in the elastic band, but you can manipulate things a little bit. So that's the basics of working with Elastic Audio and Pro Tools. All right, so now what will we hop into next? Let's hop into Logic Pro. All right, let's just re-import this over here. In fact, you know what? Let's just go ahead and delete this track because I don't need to see it anymore. And we'll just click OK. It's asking us to create a new track. Fair enough. And let's open up, and I'm going to drag the exact same loop in. So we're working with the exact same thing again, 93 BPM. Let's go ahead and close the browser over here. Now, in terms of working with Logic in this way, like I said, we need to first make sure that we've enabled the view for flex. And then I just need to come in here and I need to choose an algorithm. So in this case, I'm going to choose a polyphonic because, like I said, I'm dealing with time compression and expansion, teaching those concepts. Okay, so Logic is similar to Pro Tools here. Keep in mind that the minute we choose an algorithm, Logic auto-detects the transients. If you ever want to double-check those transients, you can open the editor by clicking E or double-clicking up here. We've got two tabs. We've got a track tab, which essentially is just a bigger view of our editing arrangement window that we have over here. Well, that's actually set pretty big as well. But then we have a file tab. And we have this little brown box over here, transient editing mode. And when we click transient editing mode, we can minus or plus to add the transient. So kind of the sensitivity of the transient detection. Now, I can double click these to remove it. Go ahead and undo that. Or I can click and drag to move the actual location. So let's say, for instance, on this point over here, this one right here, let's go ahead and zoom in. Let's say that I didn't like the job that Logic did in terms of finding or detecting this transient point. Let's say I said to myself, you know what, that's not at a perfect zero crossing. I can grab this point and I can just move it. So now I've put it right at a zero crossing. Now, this isn't going to make or break your production or anything, but it's important to know that you can move them. So you can do some manual detection in terms of adding a point. Let's say I wanted one here. I could say in this section that I just wanted to add a transient detection point. I could hold down my command key and I can just add one. Now I've added a transient detection point just right over here. And I could again fine tune this just by grabbing it and moving it. Now it's important to note, these are not the flex markers in Logic. These are the transient detection points. The flex markers, however, will be generated by these points. So I would always recommend, if you're wanting to use time compression and expansion, the flex markers in Logic, before I go ahead and quantize anything when working in Logic, I would always go ahead and I would, double check to make sure that everything is set the way I want in terms of, yep, these these transient detection points are exactly where I want. And if they're not, or if you have one and you don't need one, let's say I don't want one there, I'll go ahead and take that out. Now keep in mind, we can add or minus them. Logic will suggest where they belong, and then we can fine tune or finesse them simply by going through in the editor, making sure that we're looking at the file. Okay. Now the next thing I want to do, let's go ahead and let's close this editor, is let's have a look at this mode. So this is just the arrangement mode. Now, funny enough, this is the same as this over here if you want it to work in the editor. But let's go ahead and let's work in the arranger because the concepts apply equally. Okay, so we have the same concept that we do in Pro Tools, being that if we hover to the bottom here, in Pro Tools, if we held down the Shift key, it gave us an option to anchor down the transient detection point before and after. Now in Logic, it does the same thing. What this allows us to do is anchor these points down, and then we can adjust the timing between these, right? So I could do this anywhere. So for instance, this one over here, right? I could anchor this down and move things like this. Now another point over here is I could also, by clicking these, if I decided, you know, I don't want a point here, I could click this and have this option, or I could simply double click it to get rid of it. We don't want to get rid of it. So this is the same as Pro Tools. We can anchor down the before and after points. So this gives us kind of that individual control in terms of finessing the pocket of something, getting it to sit right. We can say, right, I'm going to anchor that down. And then, you know, a good workflow approach to have when doing this type of thing is that you would have another track either above or below it. And then you would use that track as a visual guideline while you're doing this transient detection. And you could use this 3 flex marker mode where you say, right, there's a transient right here. I just want to take this and align it like that. All right. So if you don't want to have anything here, if you want to take this out, very easy. We just hover over this point over here, and you can see this is kind of cool, is that as you hover over, for instance, this one over here, it's actually telling us how far it is away from the original point. We can go ahead now, hover over this, click the X here, gets rid of it altogether, or I could just single click on it to bring it back. And then we have the 1 point over here, which allows us to add the 3. We also have a mode over here. Let's go down somewhere. In fact, let's just kind of restore this to its original timing. We'll just do a bunch of undos over here. We'll get this back to where it was, whoops, in the beginning. This one over here is a single click. And watch what happens. When I pull this out, you can see this is slightly different than Pro Tools in that it's locked down the end of this region, but it's pulling out all of the timing here. Everything, it's pulling it all out. So this would be time compressing or expanding the timing of everything. So it's kind of important to know what it is that you want to do. But like I said, a lot of the times this triple mode is really good. Now, if you just want to add specific points, so let's say that Logic went ahead and did its transient detection, and you said, right, that's great, thank you very much, but I only want to have some of those points that you've added. So for instance, I could single click this one, this one, this one, and this one. Now, I could go ahead now and just do my flex movements just on these points, right? And go ahead and just pull this out a little bit. But keep in mind that it's going to time compress and expand everything in between those. So that's working with Logic. Now Studio One is kind of a bit of both. So let's go here and let's just go ahead and restore our timing. And in fact, I'm going to take this track for now, and let's just go ahead and hide this. So we don't need to see that at all. Now in Studio One, I'm going to bring up the proper menu. We have the audio bend tool. So like I said here, the audio bend tool allows us to place these points in manually, but it's a little bit more complex than that because we also have a mode where we can do a detection. Now in Studio One, I guess the developers like to think in terms of making this a really smart DAW. So in Studio One, they basically say to themselves, well, we don't need to have detection points and then bend markers or transient markers or warp markers. So essentially in Studio One, when you select an audio event and you bring open this audio bend menu over here and you make sure that the bend markers are visible, all you have to do is analyze, and then you bring up your threshold. So that's something we're similar to seeing in terms of Logic, where we have a threshold. The Logic is the plus and minus key. And in Studio One, it basically gives you 2 different modes. So we can bring in our threshold, but we also have a sensitive mode. So if you want to be extra sensitive here, you can reanalyze this. And now you can see we've got a ton of transient points. So something that is really not that transient intensive, maybe try sensitive out. Most of the time though, the standard works fine. We go ahead, we detect it, we drag them up. Okay, that looks good to me. Now the idea here is that we don't now have to click on these to make them active as an audio bend marker. That's what Studio One calls it, an audio bend marker. it automatically assumes that you've done this detection, that it automatically creates these bend markers for you. Now, once you have these bend markers created, then you would choose your audio bend tool. And then you could go ahead, and this is very similar to Pro Tools and Logic in that we can go ahead and grab this and we can move it from left to right. And I'm not on a grid mode right now, so let's go ahead and undo that. And if I was on a grid mode, obviously, just like Pro Tools and Logic, it's going to snap. But the cool thing about this is it snaps, but it's elastic. So you can kind of get stuff that's in between, but as soon as you get close, it just snaps. But if you wanted to kind of split the difference on something, you can get away with it. So that's a nice feature. But then, like I said, in Studio One, if you want to move something and I can hold the shift modifier, then I relieve myself from the grid entirely. But the nice thing about Studio One is that because when you do your transient detection, it just automatically assumes that those are all going to be bend markers. We don't have to worry about locking down a point before and after. I mean, because that's automatically done. Let's just take off the grid mode or the snapping mode for now so I can move these all freely. So any point that I grab, it's automatically locked down these points over here. All right, let's get back. In fact, let me just select this and let's restore this to its original timing. And I'm going to go back to the bend tool over here and let's go ahead and quantize. Studio One, quantize is very simple. Q, quantized. Okay, and that's quantized according to the 16th notes over here. All right, so now with the bend tool active, there's also another modifier. So let's say that I wanted to move things relatively to each other. In Studio One, you hold down the Alt or Option key, then you have this arrow, and I can drag across, highlight a bunch of these together. Now I can move these all together. Keep in mind, we're not on snapping mode right now. But if I was on snapping mode, let's put snapping on, then these are going to snap, but just one of them, not necessarily all of them. They're going to maintain the relative distance between each other. Now this is important because what this means is that we can maintain something in a loop that gives it its groove and its feel. We can maintain that timing, and we can do things like say, I just want to take this whole passage over here and I want to maintain the timing and the relative distance between everything. But for example, I want to take this and snap it perfectly to the downbeat so that it starts, because that's what my other groove is doing. And then the intricacies in the pocket of the groove, it can happen in between. So, like I said, Studio One, my opinion, it's kind of the best of all of the worlds because I can, maintain my time in between these. Now, the other thing I can do is, let's go ahead here and we'll select this event here. We'll reanalyze it. We'll bring a threshold all the way up. In fact, let's go to sensitive. Let's reanalyze this. Now, when I start bringing things up in sensitive, there's a lot of detection points that are coming up here. The other thing I can do is it's very easy for us to remove these points over here. So for example, with the bend tool active, I can highlight across these ones over here. I'm going to take my snapping or my grid mode off for a second, and I can just delete the ones that I don't want. Now, when you pair that with some other functions like Shift, Alt, or Option, zoom in, kind of have a closer look and say, yeah, you know what? I don't want this one. We'll get rid of that. Or maybe scroll along here and say, right, both of these over here, I don't need these. And then we can just zoom out. You can really kind of analyze and detect your points very accurately. And then all you need to do is just select this audio region here, click the Q, and you're able to quantize. That's pretty much it for this video. We have an understanding of the different tools. Like I said, in Pro Tools, we're looking at warp points, warp markers. In Logic, it's the flex markers. In Studio One, it's audio bend markers. They all function very, very similar. Some of them have strengths where others have weaknesses. But it's important to note that they all pretty much do the same thing. They give you the ability to detect transients. They give you the ability to transfer or very quickly turn those transient detection points into a warp marker, a flex marker, or an audio bend marker of some sort. And then they also all give you the ability to edit those points, and we can do things like lock them down. And then in some DAWs, or in a couple of these DAWs, we can shift select some of them and maintain the relative time in between passages. And this is going to come in handy later on in the series. So anyways, that's it for this video, and I hope you guys got something from it, and we'll talk to you later. Cheers.